Karoline Leavitt walked into a Plaistow courtroom, only to be fined $500 for arriving 3 minutes late. Judge Grayson mocked her as a young dumb seesaw aide, while the crowd laughed. Nobody else faced his wrath. But Karoline wasn't just a press secretary, she was a legal mind with evidence to topple him. So who was really out of their depth? Before we dive into this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us hit 1,000 subscribers and keeps us telling stories that matter. Thank you. Karoline Leavitt pushed open the heavy oak door of the Plaistow Town Hall courtroom, her footsteps echoing on the worn hardwood floor. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her thin-framed glasses sat low on her nose. In her hand, a slim folder of documents crinkled slightly. She was 3 minutes late, stuck behind a delivery truck on Main Street, and the room was already buzzing. Rows of locals filled the benches, their murmurs rising as she walked toward the witness stand. At the front, Judge Edward Grayson, a stout man in his 60s with a flushed face and thinning gray hair, glared at her over his reading glasses. Name Grayson barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. Karoline opened her mouth to answer, but he didn't wait. You're late. This court doesn't run on your schedule. Young lady, $500 for disrespecting the proceedings. He scribbled on a notepad, his pen scratching loudly. The crowd stirred. A woman in a navy blazer, Martha Klein, a local lawyer with a tight smile, leaned toward her client. James Whitaker, a contractor in a crisp suit, and whispered something that made him chuckle. Karoline froze, her fingers tightening around her folder. She'd come to testify in a contract dispute between Whitaker and her former employer, a small tech firm. The fine stung, but Grayson's tone, dripping with condescension, hit harder. Sir, I was delayed by traffic. May I explain? She asked, her voice steady but soft. Grayson waved her off. You think you're special because you work in D.C. Sit down or leave. The crowd's whispers grew. Tom Reynolds, a middle-aged mechanic in a flannel shirt, nudged the man next to him, muttering, She's just some press aide. Should have known her place. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She set her folder on the table and placed a worn-out pen beside it, its ink nearly gone from years of note-taking. Her eyes flicked to Grayson, who was already questioning Whitaker, nodding along to his smooth answers while ignoring the tech firm's evidence. As she sat, a man in the row ahead, John Miller, fumbled his stack of papers, sending them spilling across the floor. He was older, with a tired face and a rumpled jacket. Another defendant in a different case, without a word. Karoline knelt to help him gather the sheets. Thank you, Miller said quietly, his voice hoarse. Nobody else noticed. Martha Klein smirked, whispering to Whitaker again, and the crowd's attention stayed on Grayson, who was now praising Whitaker's reliable testimony. Karoline leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing the pen. She'd seen judges like Grayson before, men who wielded power like a club, picking favorites based on connections. Whitaker, with his ties to the town council, was clearly the favorite here. She glanced at Miller, who was clutching his papers, his shoulders slumped under Grayson's earlier dismissal. Something in her chest tightened. Not just for herself, but for him. For everyone this judge steamrolled. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and jotted a quick note. Grayson biased toward Whitaker, ignored Exhibit B. Her pen scratched faintly, the sound lost in the hum of the courtroom. She wasn't here to fight Grayson. Not yet. But she'd been in enough high-stakes rooms to know when someone was rigging the game. Her time in Trump's campaign had taught her to watch, wait, and strike only when the moment was right. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Grayson called a recess, his gavel slamming with a thud. People shuffled toward the exit, their voices rising in casual chatter. Karoline stayed seated, her eyes on the judge's empty chair. She picked up her pen, rolling it between her fingers. It was a cheap thing, bought years ago when she was still a college intern, but it had seen her through late-night strategy sessions and countless battles. As she stood to leave, she caught Grayson's glance from the bench. His lips curled slightly, as if daring her to challenge him. She met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. Under her breath, so quiet no one could hear, she said, "You'll see who I am." Karoline Leavitt sat in her beat-up Honda, parked in the gravel lot outside Plaistow's town hall. The courtroom's heavy air still clung to her as she stared at her phone, its screen glowing with unread messages from her White House team. Press briefing at 3 p.m. tomorrow. One read. Another need your notes on the trade talks. ASAP, she sighed, rubbing her temples. The $500 fine from Judge Grayson wasn't just a hit to her wallet. It was a public slap. A reminder of how people saw her a young aide, out of her league in a small-town courtroom. She leaned back, the worn leather seat creaking under her weight, her glasses fogged slightly from the cold October air seeping through a cracked window. She thought back to her early days with Trump's campaign. Long nights poring over legal memos in a cramped defiance office. A colleague, barely 25, had been mocked by a senior strategist for suggesting a policy tweak. "Stick to fetching coffee. Kid," he'd said. The memory stung. Karoline had vowed then to learn the law, not for a degree, but to never let anyone dismiss her again. She'd spent years studying statutes, case law, anything she could get her hands on, all while juggling press duties. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her mom popped up. "Don't let them walk over your pride, honey." Karoline's lips twitched into a faint smile. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Modo, working 16-hour days, her fridge stocked with takeout and instant coffee. Her dream wasn't fame or power, it was a small legal aid fund to help people like John Miller, the man she'd helped in court, who couldn't afford a fancy lawyer to fight men like Grayson. She wanted respect, not just for herself, but for everyone who got steamrolled by the system. Karoline pulled out her notebook and flipped to a fresh page. Her worn pen scratched as she wrote. Grayson interrupted tech firm's counsel 3 times, ignored Exhibit B contract terms, favored Whitaker's testimony without questions. She paused, replaying the judge's sneer, his quick nod to Whitaker, a contractor with deep ties to Plaistow's town council. The unfairness gnawed at her, not just for her case but for the others she'd seen Grayson dismiss. She jotted another note, check Miller's case file, possible pattern. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, save for the crunch of footsteps. Lisa Bennett, a local reporter with a notepad tucked under her arm, passed by, glancing at Karoline's car. Karoline didn't notice. She was muttering to herself, her voice low but firm. "I'm not here for headlines. I just want justice." Lisa slowed, catching the words through the cracked window, and scribbled something down before walking on. Karoline's fingers brushed her phone, waking the screen. She opened her voice memo app, a habit from her campaign days to record ideas on the fly. Her thumb froze as she saw a file labeled Courtroom 1017. She tapped it, and Grayson's voice crackled through. "You think you're special because you work in D.C. Sit down or leave." Her breath caught. The app had auto-recorded when she'd fumbled with her phone during the hearing. Every word his mockery. His dismissal was captured. She played it again, her heart picking up speed. The recording wasn't just about her fine. It showed Grayson's bias, his refusal to let her speak, his cozy exchange with Whitaker. She leaned forward, her glasses sliding down her nose. This wasn't just a personal slight anymore. It was evidence. A crack in the judge's armor. She tucked her phone into her bag. her fingers steady but her mind racing. The lot was empty now, the town hall's lights dimming as staff locked up. Karoline started the car, the engine sputtering before it caught. She glanced at her notebook, the pen lying across it, its ink nearly spent. She'd carried it through every fight, every late night, every moment she'd been underestimated. Today, it had started a new battle. Her eyes narrowed as she pulled onto the road, the courtroom fading in her rearview mirror. Karoline Leavitt slipped back into the Plaistow courtroom, choosing a seat in the back row where the wooden bench creaked under her weight. The room smelled of old varnish and coffee, and the hum of voices filled the air as Judge Edward Grayson resumed the session. Her glasses sat low on her nose, and her notebook rested on her lap, the worn pen tucked into its spine. She kept her eyes on Grayson, who was questioning a witness from her former employer's tech firm. His voice was sharp, cutting off the witness mid-sentence to praise James Whitaker's clear and concise testimony. Karoline's fingers twitched. She jotted a note. Grayson dismissed Exhibit C without review. The judge's bias was blatant. Whitaker, the contractor, sat confidently in his tailored suit, nodding along as Grayson ignored the tech firm's evidence. Karoline scanned the room. Martha Klein, Whitaker's lawyer, scribbled notes, her lips curled in a satisfied smirk. The crowd, a mix of locals like Tom Reynolds, a mechanic with a phone in hand, and other defendants, watched passively. Karoline's gaze landed on John Miller, the older man she'd helped yesterday. He sat hunched, clutching a crumpled folder, his face pale as Grayson berated him for missing a filing deadline in his own case. "You're wasting my time, Miller," Grayson snapped, tossing a document aside. Karoline's chest tightened. Miller's defeated look reminded her of her campaign days. Watching colleagues get brushed off for being young or inexperienced, she reached into her bag, pulling out a spare complaint form she'd kept from her D.C. work. It was a simple document, one anyone could file to challenge a judge's conduct. As Grayson called a brief recess, she leaned forward, catching Miller's eye. "Here," she whispered, sliding the form across the bench. "This might help." Miller hesitated, then took it, his fingers trembling. "Why are you doing this?" he asked softly. "Because someone has to," she said, her voice firm. Martha Klein, standing nearby, caught the exchange. She straightened, her navy blazer crisp, and stepped closer. "What's this playing lawyer now?" Her tone was mocking, loud enough to draw eyes from the crowd. Tom Reynolds glanced up from his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button. Karoline met Martha's gaze, unflinching. "Someone's got to do what's right," she said, her words clipped but calm. Martha scoffed, turning back to Whitaker, but her eyes lingered on Karoline, narrowing slightly. Grayson returned to the bench, his gavel banging to silence the room. Karoline sat back, her heart pounding but her face composed. She knew helping Miller could backfire. Meddling in another case wasn't her place, but staying silent felt worse. She opened her notebook again. Writing Miller's case, Grayson refused to hear motion for extension. Susan Harper, the court clerk, a woman with graying hair and a tired expression, glanced at Karoline from her desk. Her look wasn't friendly, more like she was sizing up a troublemaker. Karoline ignored it, her pen moving steadily. The session dragged on, Grayson's rulings growing more lopsided. He approved Whitaker's motions without debate while dismissing the tech firm's objections as irrelevant. Karoline's notes piled up, each line a piece of the judge's pattern. She caught Tom Reynolds filming the room, his phone angled toward Grayson. She didn't know he'd captured her handing Miller the form, the moment now saved on his device. As the hearing wrapped, people shuffled toward the exit. Karoline stood, tucking her notebook into her bag. A folder slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a soft thud. It was an old campaign file, stamped with a Trump logo and filled with legal memos. Before she could grab it, Martha Klein swooped in. Picking it up, she scanned the cover, her brow furrowing. "What's this?" she muttered, her voice low. Karoline reached for it, but Martha held it a moment longer, her eyes flicking to Karoline's face. "Who are you?" "Really?" she said, almost to herself. Before handing it back, Karoline took the folder, her expression neutral. She walked out. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Martha's question hung in the air, unanswered. Karoline's fingers brushed her pen, still tucked in her notebook. She hadn't planned to stir things up, but the form she'd given Miller was a spark, and sparks, she knew, could start fires. Karoline Leavitt stood in the middle of the Plaistow courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as Judge Edward Grayson's voice boomed from the bench. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn wooden floor. Grayson's face was redder than usual. His eyes narrowed as he pointed a thick finger at her. "You think you can meddle in my courtroom?" he said, his words slicing through the air, handing out forms to defendants. "That's interference, young lady." The crowd, packed into the benches, shifted and whispered. Karoline's glasses slipped slightly, but she didn't adjust them. Her notebook and worn pen sat untouched on the table behind her. She'd been called up mid-session, right after Grayson resumed the contract dispute case. Her act of giving John Miller a complaint form yesterday had somehow reached the judge's ears. "I was helping someone who needed it," Karoline said, her voice calm but firm. Grayson scoffed, slamming his gavel. "You're not a lawyer. You're a witness. And you're done here. I'm revoking your right to testify." The room erupted in murmurs. Martha Klein, standing beside her client James Whitaker, smirked and leaned forward. "She's trying to sabotage the case," Martha said loudly, her navy blazer crisp as she addressed the judge. "This is deliberate disruption." Karoline's stomach twisted, but her face stayed composed. She glanced at the crowd. Tom Reynolds, the mechanic, sat with his phone lowered, his brow furrowed as if unsure what to make of her. Others, locals she didn't know, shook their heads, muttering about kids with no respect. Susan Harper, the court clerk, sat at her desk, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She avoided Karoline's eyes, her lips pressed thin in disapproval, the weight of their judgment pressed down, heavier than Grayson's fine had been. "Leave my courtroom," Grayson ordered, his gavel poised. Karoline picked up her notebook, her fingers brushing the worn pen. She walked toward the exit, her steps steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. She'd come to help her old company, to present evidence against Whitaker's shady contract dealings. Now, she was out, her chance gone. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hallway's cool air hitting her face. Behind her, Grayson resumed the session, his voice already praising Whitaker's credible documentation. In the hallway, Karoline leaned against the wall, her folder tucked under her arm. The tile floor was scuffed, the bulletin board nearby plastered with town notices. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. Helping Miller had been a risk, but she hadn't expected this: a public dressing down and a ban from testifying. She thought of her campaign days, the late nights when she'd learned to keep going even when the room turned against her. This wasn't new, just louder. Lisa Bennett, the reporter, appeared from around the corner, her notepad in hand. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Karoline shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm fine," she said finally. Her tone clipped. Lisa nodded, scribbling something, but didn't push. Karoline turned away, her fingers tightening around her folder. She didn't need pity. She needed a plan. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another work email. Instead, it was a text from a colleague in D.C. Karoline, you're trending online. People are trashing you. Her thumb swiped to a local Plesto forum linked in the message. A video, shaky but clear, showed her handing Miller the form, with comments below entitled D.C. Girl thinks she's above the law. Who does she think she is? Her jaw clenched. Tom Reynolds must have posted it. Though she didn't know why. The words stung, but she didn't linger on them. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her other hand finding the worn pen in her bag. Its familiar weight grounded her. She hadn't come to Plaistow to be liked. She'd come to tell the truth. And Grayson's outburst only proved she'd hit a nerve. The hallway was empty now. Lisa gone. The courtroom's muffled voices leaking through the door. Karoline straightened, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't done yet. Karoline Leavitt pushed open the glass door of the Corner Brew, a small coffee shop on Plaistow's main drag. The bell above jingling faintly. The smell of roasted beans hit her as she scanned the room, her glasses fogging briefly from the warm air. It was late afternoon, and the place was half empty, with a few locals nursing mugs at scuffed wooden tables. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, but she ignored it, spotting John Miller in a corner booth. The older man, his rumpled jacket hanging loosely, waved her over. A thin folder on the table in front of him. She slid into the booth, her notebook tucked under her arm, the worn pen clipped to its cover. Since yesterday's courtroom fiasco, where Judge Grayson had kicked her out for helping Miller, her name had been dragged online. The video of her passing him the complaint form, posted by Tom Reynolds, had split the town's opinion. Some called her a troublemaker, others, a few, saw her as standing up to a bully. Karoline hadn't slept much, her mind replaying Grayson's sneer and Martha Klein's accusations. Coffee, Miller asked, his voice gravelly but kind. She nodded, and he signaled the waitress. Thanks for coming, he said, leaning forward. I wasn't sure you would after yesterday. Karoline adjusted her glasses, her expression guarded. Your email was vague, she said. What's this about? Miller opened the folder, revealing a single sheet with a handwritten note. I owe you for that form, he said. Most people would have looked the other way. He paused as the waitress set down 2 steaming mugs. Karoline wrapped her hands around hers, the heat grounding her. Miller lowered his voice. I wasn't always just a guy fighting parking fines. I was general counsel for a Fortune 500 company. Retired 5 years ago to keep a low profile here. Her eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent, waiting. Grayson's been running that courtroom like his personal kingdom for years. He went on. I've seen it. So have others. When you helped me, I called a contact at the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. Karoline's grip on the mug tightened. She hadn't expected this. Miller slid the folder toward her. I told them about Grayson's bias in your case and mine. They're interested, but they need evidence. Your evidence. His words hung heavy. She thought of the recording on her phone, Grayson's voice mocking her, dismissing her testimony. It won't be easy, Miller warned, his eyes steady. Grayson's got friends in high places. You sure you want to take this on? She leaned back, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to walk away, back to D.C., to her press briefings and late-night emails, but the memory of Grayson's gavel, the crowd's whispers, and Miller's defeated slump in court pushed back. She'd seen unfairness before, in campaign war rooms, in small-town disputes. Staying quiet now would mean letting it win. What do they need? She asked, her voice low but firm. Miller nodded, as if he'd expected her answer. Anything concrete: recordings, notes, witnesses. I've got some old files on Grayson's rulings, patterns of favoritism. I can share them if you're in. At a nearby table, Lisa Bennett, the reporter, sipped her coffee, her notepad open. She'd come for a quiet lunch but caught Karoline's name in the conversation. Her pen moved quickly, jotting down fragments Karoline didn't notice. Her focus on Miller. The shop's door jingled as a group of locals entered, their voices loud. Online, the debate over Karoline was growing. Tom Reynolds' video had hit 1,000 views, with comments now praising her for helping Miller, though others still called her reckless. She hadn't checked her phone, didn't know the tide was shifting. Miller reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table. "This has what I've got," he said. "Court records. A few complaints that never went anywhere. It's a start." Karoline stared at the drive, her fingers hovering over it. Taking it meant diving deeper, risking more than a fine or a bad headline. She thought of her mom's text, "Don't let them walk over your pride." She picked up the drive, slipping it into her pocket. "I'm not letting this go," she said. Miller's face softened, a faint smile breaking through. "Good," he said. "So, you're standing up, or are you letting it slide?" She met his gaze, her jaw set. The question wasn't just about Grayson, it was about every time she'd been dismissed, every time someone like Miller had been ignored. She didn't answer, but her hand closed around the USB. The decision made, Karoline Leavitt sat at the small kitchen table in her D.C. apartment, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above and the glow of her laptop screen. Papers from John Miller's USB were spread out, their edges curling in the humid air. Her worn pen rested beside a half-empty coffee mug, her notebook open to a page of scribbled notes. The clock read 11:43 p.m. But sleep wasn't an option. She replayed the courtroom recording on her phone. Judge Grayson's voice sharp. "You think you're special because you work in D.C." Each word fueled her resolve, but the weight of what came next pressed harder. She clicked through Miller's files, old court records detailing Grayson's rulings. 3 cases, all involving James Whitaker, showed the same pattern. Grayson dismissed opposing evidence, rushed hearings, and ruled for Whitaker, who had ties to Plesto's town council. One file noted a dismissed complaint against Grayson from 2018, buried without investigation. Karoline's fingers paused on the keyboard. This wasn't just about her $500 fine or the contract dispute. It was a system, rigged for the connected. And she held proof. Her phone buzzed. A text from Susan Harper, the court clerk. "Heard you're digging into Grayson. Don't make waves. You'll lose any chance of working here again." Karoline stared at the message, her jaw tightening. Susan's warning wasn't a threat, just a fact. Going public could mean lawsuits, a trashed reputation, maybe worse. She could stay quiet, return to her White House job, and let Plesto's courtroom churn on, the safe choice. But then she remembered a campaign staffer, young and eager, shut down by a senior aide for speaking up. She'd promised herself she'd never be that silent. Karoline opened her email, drafting a message to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. She attached the recording and Miller's files, her fingers steady but her pulse racing. "Judge Grayson has shown repeated bias," she typed, citing specific cases. She hit send, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. There was no going back now. The next morning, she walked into the Plesto courtroom, her glasses polished, her notebook tucked under her arm. The room was fuller than before. Locals whispering about the online video of her helping Miller. Tom Reynolds sat near the front, phone in hand, filming again. Martha Klein stood beside Whitaker, her eyes flicking to Karoline with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Susan Harper sat at her desk, her face unreadable. Grayson entered, his gavel banging to start the session. He called Whitaker's case, his tone brisk, ready to steamroll through. Karoline stood, her voice cutting through the hum. "Your Honor, I request a suspension of this hearing. The room fell silent. Grayson's head snapped up, his face darkening. You're out of line. Ms. Leavitt, sit down. She didn't. I have evidence of judicial bias in this case and others. She said, her words clear, deliberate. I've submitted it to the Judicial Conduct Committee. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tom's phone stayed steady, capturing every second. Martha's pen froze mid-note. Whitaker shifted in his seat, his confident smile gone. Grayson's hand gripped the gavel, his knuckles white. This is absurd, he sputtered. You're a disgruntled witness. Nothing more. Karoline stepped forward, pulling the USB from her pocket. These files show your pattern of favoring Mr. Whitaker, ignoring evidence, and dismissing valid motions. The committee has them now, the crowd murmured, some leaning forward, others exchanging looks. Susan Harper's eyes widened, her fingers twitching on her desk. Karoline walked to Susan's desk, holding out the USB. Please enter this as evidence, she said, her voice unwavering. Susan hesitated, glancing at Grayson, then took it, her hands shaking slightly. The room felt electric, every eye on Karoline. Grayson's face was ashen, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Martha whispered urgently to Whitaker, who shook his head, his eyes darting to the exit. Karoline stood tall, her glasses catching the light. She'd made her choice, knowing the cost. The crowd stares, some shocked, some approving, followed her. She didn't look back, but she felt Grayson's glare, a silent promise of retaliation. Susan clutched the USB, her face pale. The gavel hung in Grayson's hand. Unstruck, Karoline Leavitt stood in the center of the Plesto courtroom, her hands steady despite the weight of every eye on her. The air was thick. The hum of the crowd hushed as Judge Edward Grayson glared from the bench, his face a mottled red. She just handed Susan Harper the USB drive, her voice still echoing from declaring evidence of his bias. Her glasses caught the glare of the fluorescent lights, but she didn't blink. In her pocket, her worn pen pressed against her thigh, a quiet reminder of why she was here. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Grayson's gavel trembled in his hand. This is a stunt, he snapped, his voice cracking. You're slandering this court. Karoline didn't flinch. The evidence speaks for itself, she said, her tone even. The recording of your comments, the files showing your favoritism toward Mr. Whitaker. They're with the Judicial Conduct Committee now. She gestured to the USB in Susan's hands. The clerk, her gray bun tight, looked down at the drive, her fingers twitching. Miss Harper, Karoline said. Please confirm the evidence is logged. Susan hesitated, her eyes flicking to Grayson, then nodded stiffly. It's logged, she said, her voice barely audible. The crowd erupted in whispers. Tom Reynolds, near the front, held his phone steady, live streaming to a growing online audience. Comments flashed across his screen. She's got guts and Grayson's done. James Whitaker, the contractor, shifted in his seat, his tailored suit suddenly too tight. Martha Klein, his lawyer, stood abruptly, her navy blazer creased. Your Honor, she said, her voice wavering. I need to speak. Grayson's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. Not now, he growled. But Martha pressed on. I've seen your rulings favor certain people, she said, glancing at Whitaker. I kept quiet because I needed this job. I was wrong. The room exploded in gasps. Karoline's breath caught, not expecting an ally in Martha. The lawyer's admission was a crack in the wall Grayson had built. Tom's live stream surged, hitting thousands of views. Locals leaned forward, some nodding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Susan Harper clutched the USB tighter, her face pale but resolute. Karoline felt a rush of relief, tempered by the knot in her stomach. She'd bet everything, her reputation, her career on this moment. Grayson's power was crumbling, but he wasn't down yet. Grayson slammed his gavel, the sound sharp. "Order," he shouted, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "This hearing is recessed until further notice." He stood, his robes swishing, and stormed toward his chambers. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of shock and excitement. Karoline stayed rooted, her eyes on Susan, who was entering the USB into the court record. Martha sat down, avoiding Whitaker's glare. He whispered something sharp, but she shook her head, her hands clasped tightly. Outside, word was spreading. Lisa Bennett, the reporter, had slipped out during the chaos, already typing up an article. She'd interviewed John Miller that morning, the retired lawyer whose files Karoline had used. His story, decades of watching Grayson's bias, silenced until now, was live on the local paper's site by noon. Online, Plaistow residents shared Tom's video, their comments turning from skepticism to outrage. A small group gathered outside the town hall, holding signs "Justice for Plaistow." The protest was unplanned, fueled by years of frustration with Grayson's heavy-handed rulings. Karoline felt the shift in the room. The crowd's eyes no longer hostile but curious, some even admiring. She thought of her campaign days, the moments she'd stood up for what was right, even when it cost her. This was bigger, riskier. Her phone buzzed, likely her D.C. team, wondering why she was trending again, but she ignored it. She'd face those consequences later. For now, she'd done what she came to do. Susan handed the USB back, her expression softer. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said quietly. Karoline nodded, slipping the drive into her pocket. The crowd began to disperse, some clapping as they passed her. Tom lowered his phone, giving her a small nod. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. The Judicial Conduct Committee had called during the recess, confirming they'd opened an investigation and suspended Grayson pending review. The news spread like fire. Karoline picked up her notebook, her fingers brushing the worn pen. She glanced at Grayson's empty chair, its dark wood gleaming under the lights. He'd left without a word, his gavel abandoned on the bench. The crowd's applause grew louder, a wave of approval she hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. She turned to leave, her steps deliberate, the pen's weight a quiet anchor. "This isn't over," she said under her breath, her voice lost in the noise. Karoline Leavitt stepped through the double doors of Plaistow's town hall, the late November chill following her inside. The courtroom was quieter now, its wooden benches half filled with locals awaiting routine hearings. A month had passed since her stand against Judge Grayson, and the air felt different, lighter, less oppressive. Her glasses sat snug on her nose, her hair still tied back, but her shoulders were relaxed. In her pocket, the worn pen, its ink long spent, pressed against her side. She wasn't here to testify today, just to see the change she'd helped spark. The new judge, Emily Torres, a woman in her 50s with a calm demeanor, took the bench. Her robes hung neatly, and her first words were a promise. "This court will serve justice fairly, for everyone." The crowd nodded, some clapping softly. Grayson was gone, suspended and later removed after the Judicial Conduct Committee's investigation confirmed his years of bias. Plaistow had buzzed with the news, fueled by Lisa Bennett's articles and Tom Reynolds' viral video. Karoline's name was still whispered in diners and shops. The D.C. girl who took down a judge. She slipped into a back row, unnoticed by most. Her phone was silent. No D.C. emails today. She'd taken a rare day off, driving up from Washington to meet John Miller later. They were laying the groundwork for a legal aid fund. Something small to help people like the defendants Grayson had dismissed. It was her old dream, once just a late-night thought, now taking shape. She felt steady, content, knowing one fight had led to this. Outside, the town was healing. The protests had faded, replaced by community meetings about court reform. Susan Harper, the clerk, had enrolled in law school part-time. Inspired by Karoline's resolve, Karoline had heard this from Lisa, who tracked her down at the corner brew last week, over coffee. Karoline had kept it brief. Justice doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs the right moment. Lisa scribbled the quote, but Karoline waved off further interviews. She didn't want the spotlight. A young woman approached her now, a college student named Clara, who'd asked Karoline to speak at a local civic group. "You're why I'm studying law," Clara said, her voice earnest. Karoline smiled. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the worn pen, its plastic scratched from years of use. "This got me through some tough fights," she said, handing it to Clara. "Keep it. Write your own story." Clara's eyes widened, her fingers closing around the pen as if it were a treasure. The hearing ended, and Karoline stepped into the hallway, the tile floor gleaming under new lights. Plaistow felt alive again. It's people talking about fairness, not just gossiping. She'd seen it in the diner yesterday, locals debating how to elect better judges. Inspired by her stand, she hadn't planned to be their spark, but she didn't mind. Her work with Miller was just starting, and Susan's choice to study law felt like a quiet victory. Karoline walked outside, the town hall's stone steps cold under her shoes. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange over Main Street. A group of young people stood across the road, holding signs "Justice for All." They weren't protesting, just gathering, their voices hopeful. Clara was among them, clutching the pen, already talking to the others. Karoline paused, watching them. She thought of her campaign days, the battles won by showing up, speaking truth. This was bigger, a ripple she couldn't have predicted. She turned, her coat flapping in the breeze, and started down the street. Lisa Bennett, lingering nearby, called out, "Karoline." One quote for the paper. Karoline shook her head, her smile faint. "The story's not about me," she said, her voice soft but clear. She kept walking, the town hall fading behind her. The kids' signs glowed in the dusk, their words a promise Plaistow wouldn't forget. Karoline vanished into the evening, her steps sure, leaving only the echo of change. A single pen, scratched and faded, changed a town's story. It wasn't loud, didn't demand attention, but it wrote the truth when no one else would. Sometimes, the smallest acts speak loudest, not in cheers, but in the quiet shift of hearts. What do you carry that could rewrite a wrong? If this story moved you, subscribe to Crossfire Justice for more tales that linger. Thank you for watching.